And because I have insisted so long upon this instance, I shall in some other particulars only direct my reader to the particular places of the defense, where, after he has compared them with Mr. Currie's vindication, he may see with his own eyes that Mr. Currie has never entered into the argument. 'Tis like Mr. Currie in his boasting manner may tell his reader in his next that his reasonings are unanswerable, but from the swatch I have given the reader of his arguings upon the first instance of tyranny, he may judge of the rest. For my part, I judge them so trifling that I do not think it worth my while to spend time further upon them, and I think it proper to be the shorter upon the instances of the tyranny of the present judicatories that I have cast up since writing the defense. The second instance I give of tyranny in the administration is the Act of Assembly 1733, appointing the Reverend Mr. Ebenezer Erskine to be rebuked for impugning several acts of assembly and proceedings of the church judicatories, by which act and sentence, ministerial freedom was condemned, and the ministers of the church were bound up from testifying against such proceedings of church judicatories and such acts of assembly which might have a direct tendency to subvert our Constitution and to enslave the flock and heritage of God. For Mr. Erskine's doctrine, for which he was rebuked, was directed against the Act 1732 and the violent proceedings of the church judicatories in the settlement of ministers. In the third place, the tyranny of the judicatories did yet rise higher when, in consequence of the act and sentence of the foresaid assembly, 4 ministers were thrust out from the ministerial communion with the judicatories for a protestation against the above act and sentence restricting ministerial freedom, and that merely for their own exoneration and for asserting their privilege and duty to testify publicly against steps of defection upon all proper occasions. Upon the above heads, Mr. Currie in his vindication repeats over what he had said in his essay without ever entering into the argument as I have laid it in the defense. As, for instance, he alleges that the Act of the Assembly 1733 against all 4 brethren was repealed by what was done in the Assembly 1734 and by the Synod of Perth and Stirling in consequence of the said deed. But he never once enters into my reasons by which I prove that the Act 1733 against the brethren was never either formally or materially repealed. Though he pretends to follow me foot for foot, yet he passeth over my reasonings in deep silence, particularly the argument as I lay it before him from the brethren's paper, entitled Reasons for Not Acceding. The reader may see with his own eyes if he compares defense page 111, 112, 113, and 114 with the vindication page 116 and 117. With respect to the restricting of ministerial freedom and the testifying doctrinally against the sinful proceedings of church judicatories, which I affirm is plainly condemned by the Act of Assembly 1733, Mr. Currie never touches the argument as I have laid it. Defense page 114, from the middle, and pages 115 and 116, compared with the vindication, pages 116 and 117, where the reader will find that he tells over and over again what he has learned from his new friends, the narrative writers, to wit, that Mr. Erskine was not rebuked for testifying against the Act 1732 and other proceedings of church judicatories, but for the manner of doing it. But this is fully answered by the brethren in their review of the narrative, pages 9, 10, and 11. I shall only further observe upon this head that Mr. Currie tells his reader in his vindication on page 116 that once he took the sentence against Mr. Erskine to be for impugning the Act 1732 and the other proceedings of church judicatories, that he finds that this is absolutely denied by such as voted in that sentence, who, he says, continued to affirm that it was for the manner of doing it. But it seems that whatever Mr. Currie's thoughts about the Act 1733 were formerly, that he has become so ubiquitous now that his new friends, the narrative writers, that he will take their say in direct contradiction to the express words of the Act of Assembly. But he might have known that their above affirmation was an after invention to extricate themselves out of the thickets in which they found themselves entangled by their arbitrary act and sentence. The tyranny of the judicatories did yet further increase when, by an act of the same Assembly, 1733, the highest censures of the Church are denounced against ministers if they dispense sealing ordinances to such as are aggrieved with intruders, and whereby people who cannot submit to the ministry of such who, even in Mr. Currie's account in his Jus Populi Divinum, above quoted, are impious robbers guilty of rapine and sacrilege, are excommunicated from sealing ordinances. This was done materially by the act of the foresaid assembly against the ministers of the Presbytery of Dunfermline. A fifth instance of the tyranny of the present judicatories is that by the above-mentioned acts and deeds, several sinful and unwarrantable terms of communion are imposed upon the ministers and other members of this church. I treat of this act of tyranny in a section by itself in the defense, page 127, and in the same place I condescend upon 4 new and unwarrantable terms of communion, and I prove that by the Acts of Assembly 1733 against the protesting ministers and the ministers of the Presbytery of Dunfermline, unwarrantable terms of communion are imposed upon the ministers and members of this church. The defense, page 129, 130, and 131, which, if the reader is pleased to compare with Vindication, page 132, he will find that Mr. Currie repeats the same things again and again without ever entering into the argument. There is indeed one new thing advanced by Mr. Currie, and that is an appeal to the Reverend Mr. Erskine, in Vindication, page 131, to whom he gives a very just character, and it is Mr. Currie's ordinary, when any author is alleged by him for the support, as he may apprehend of his argument, some great character or other is given him, though perhaps in other respects he may differ widely from him. And what is it that the Reverend Mr. Erskine says? Says Mr. Currie, he pleads in his reasons of appeal that our confession of faith, form of church government, and other subordinate standards are the only terms of ministerial communion amongst us, and that the synod, by their sentence, rebuking him for preaching against the Act 1732, made the said act a term of ministerial communion, and therefore, says Mr. Currie, Mr. Erskine argues that if the foresaid act be a term of ministerial communion, why not other acts, etc.? State of the process, page 43. Mr. Currie might have added that the brethren who dissented from the sentence of that synod argued in the same way and manner, state of process, page 57. To all which I reply that Mr. Erskine in his above reasonings, as they are more fully set down in the state of the process, and all the dissenting brethren argued very justly as the case then stood. But what is the amount of Mr. Currie's reasonings upon this head? It is even this. Mr. Erskine pled that when he was rebuked for testifying against a particular act of assembly, the Synod of Perth did thereby make particular acts of assembly terms of ministerial communion. But the Assembly 1733, who met half a year thereafter, and who affirmed the sentences of the Synod of Perth and Stirling, and who condemned Mr. Erskine for impugning acts of assembly and proceedings of church judicatories, have not by their authority established new terms of ministerial communion. Who may not see the weakness and inconsistency of such reasoning? If I were to speak in Mr. Currie's strain, I would say it is unworthy of the weakest. But I shall only say, his above arguing for Mr. Erskine's reasons of appeal is that he sometimes speaks a mere blind and fallacy. The last instance I give of tyranny in the administration, in my defense on page 117, is the contempt the present judicatories have cast upon the petitions and representations of ministers and other church members who have come to their bar, spreading out their lamentable grievances before them, and craving that the judicatories might discharge their duty for the honor of God and the relief of his oppressed heritage. But what treatment have such petitions and representations met with? They have been refused a simple reading. The judicatories were so far from taking their grievances under consideration that they would not read their petitions in open court. Yea, a considerable body of ministers, with some ruling elders, when they came before the Assembly 1732 with a petition and representation of grievances, their petition could not get the common right and privilege of a transmit unto the Assembly. And when they came to the bar of the Assembly with their petitions in their hands, demanding that piece of common justice, to have their petition read and considered, though they were office-bearers in the house of God, they were despised and quite disregarded, as if they had not been church members. This obliged some of them to give in a signed protestation in their own name and in the name of the rest of the subscribers of the petition, quote, for the preservation of the just rights belonging to them as men, Christians, and office-bearers in this church, by the light of nature, word of God, constitutions of this church, claim of right, laws of the land, and manifold approven precedents since the Reformation to this day, to have representations and petitions anent grievances received, openly read, and taken into consideration, etc., unquote. The above deed of the Assembly is what I call, in the defense, a piece of the greatest tyranny, and Mr. Currie was one of the ministers that signed the above protestation. And yet in his vindication on page 119, he tells his reader that though they had a right to present their petition and a right to ask that it should be read and considered, and though he thought the assembly was to blame in refusing to consider it, yet he never had such a notion of tyranny or of any tyranny at all. What? Was there no tyranny in it? Was there no tyranny at all in it when Mr. Currie and others were denied a privilege which they protested in such a public manner did belong to them as men and Christians by the very light of nature as well as by the word of God, etc., and yet no tyranny at all? One might blush at such bare-faced inconsistencies. 'Tis but a sorry evasion when Mr. Currie tells his reader, quote, that one may have a good right to demand a thing and present a petition, and yet a judicatory may judge it inconvenient to receive it and to consider it at that season, unquote. I hope Mr. Currie was dealing sincerely when he signed that protestation with his other brethren, and that he thought, at that time at least, that when the assembly refused their petition or reading, that they were denied their just rights and privileges as men and Christians, etc. And therefore, his little Latin phrase about positive duties, that they bind semper, but not ad semper, though it may amuse some of his readers, stands him in little stead here. And if the reader that knows not Latin would know the meaning of Mr. Currie's Latin phrase, it is this in plain English: that it was not a positive duty obliging the Assembly 1732 at that time to read and consider the petition and representation of a body of ministers that came to their bar with their grievances, besides a petition and representation by upwards of 1,500 members of this church from different corners of the land. But as this appears to me to be inconsistent with his above protestation, so, in his way of writing, he makes but a very small account of the neglect, yea, even the contempt, that the said assembly did cast, not only upon such a body of ministers and people, but also upon the seasonable and necessary duty of contending and witnessing against the course of defection and backsliding which at this time prevailed in the church. I proceed now to give some other instances of tyranny in the administration of the judicatories which have taken place since I published the defense, and to clear my way, I must give a short narrative of some proceedings of the judicatories and of the conduct and behavior of the seceding brethren under them. The General Assembly that met anon 1738, having passed an act concerning the seceding ministers, containing many grievous and calumnious charges, in like manner empowered their commission to prepare a libel against them and to cite them before the subsequent Assembly 1739. I have already examined the act and deed of the foresaid Assembly 1738 and the defense, pages 169 and 170, etc., and therefore I shall not here make any further reflections upon it, but refer my reader to what I have there observed. The Commission of the Assembly, 1738, did, in consequence of the powers that were given them, prepare a libel against the seceding brethren. The libel was put into their hands, and they were cited to appear before the Assembly, 1739. When the libel and citation was given them, the seceding ministers judged it their duty to inquire into the language of this province, into the language of this providence, and into the duties they were thereby called unto. And some time being spent in prayer and conference upon this head, they judged that the present providence was a plain call unto them to carry their testimony somewhat further than hitherto they had done. They had already declared a secession from the judicatories upon the grounds and reasons published to the world in their first testimony. They had also found it their duty to continue in their secession, notwithstanding the act and deed of the Assembly 1734, which the Assembly 1738 call an act of clemency towards them. And they had in like manner published their reasons for continuing in secession from them in their paper entitled Reasons of Not Acceding to the Judicatories, etc. But the brethren, considering that they had never yet judicially inquired into the authority and constitution of the present judicatories, who, instead of reforming, were refusing to return unto the Lord, and who, instead of hearkening to the means used to reclaim them, were libeling and citing ministers as criminals unto their bar, for lifting up a judicial testimony for our covenanted principles, they did now see and find it to be their duty to decline the authority of the present judicatories, and to hold and repute them to be neither lawful nor right constitute courts of Christ, and accordingly a draft of their act and declinature being prepared, it was unanimously approved and enacted at Edinburgh, May 16th, 1739.